I know one of the questions, no one would be undiplomatic enough to ask me is my age. But if you did, I'd tell you, I'm old enough to have seen Ireland change utterly, and change utterly for the better. I'm old enough to have been instrumental in some of that great change. But here's the kicker. I'm young enough to be Ireland's Deputy Prime Minister, Tánaiste, and I'm young enough to be enthusiastic about my country as an international leader in inclusion, peace, and prosperity in this world. I grew up in an Ireland best summed up in the title of a major novel of the time. It was called The Valley of the Squinting Windows. Great image, is it not? A valley where all the houses have a view of the other houses, where everybody watches everybody else, but not in a good way. Not in a good way, because squinting windows only see what is narrow and what is nasty. The book title might have described Ireland for a time. After our War of Independence, we ruled ourselves, yes, but because we were still so economically dependent on our nearest neighbour, it was government for survival, not for success. The nation, for the most part, was at a level of subsistence that today would be considered really dire poverty. No electricity in many homes then, no piped water, no toilets inside the home, education for many only until the early teens, many leaving school very, very early, and very poor job prospects, a lot of immigration. One religion, very, very dominant, and dominant to the extent that where a priest could announce from the altar the name of anybody in the area, in the priest's view, who was behaving badly. Oh yes, back then, Ireland was a valley of the squinting windows. Those squinting windows looked harshly at everybody, but they looked particularly harshly at women. A young woman who became pregnant out of wedlock was very often ostracized by her own family, often banished to a religious-run institution, a mother and baby home, where her baby would be taken from her and adopted. And no choice, no life, but a life spent grieving, a life lived in the shadow of condemnation. Ireland back then was more about control than inclusion, and particularly control of women. A woman working for the government, in any job, lost her job when she married. It was the law until 1972, after I had finished in college. Getting married equaled dismissal from the civil service. Why? Because the man of the house was supposed to look after you, to provide, and therefore, why would you need a job? A woman's property was owned by her husband. Even if you wanted a card to allow you to take out a library book, you needed to be signed. Women didn't really step out of line because, you know, they all lived in that valley of the squinting windows. Now, of course, there were lots of kindnesses too, and compassion, and the human spirit always prevails. There was compassion. My grandfather exemplified both. He was the man in his local community, a small town in the south of Ireland, who provided simple, necessary services in a very quiet, respectful way. He would write letters and fill forms in the neighbourhood for people who wouldn't have been fully literate. My own father served in the Irish Army. He got his opportunity to go into the army. He was also a community voluntary worker. And at the time when the polio epidemic of the 50s had come to a halt, leaving devastation, he used to go around to the families, find out what they needed, what services they needed, and I would go with him. It was the first time I really saw terribly poor conditions that people were living in. There was terrible pride as well, though, and laughter, always, but that awful poverty. And when I look back at the photographs of President John F. Kennedy's visit to Ireland in 1963, it brings it all back. The contrast between this confident, laughing, powerful man who was visiting us, and the greyness of so many of the locations where he spent time. And yet the Irish people were so proud of him, so proud of this giant who had come to see them. And what is most interesting about John F. Kennedy's words are how often he talked about poverty. He didn't grow up in poverty, of course he didn't, quite the opposite. But his family did carry an almost indelible memory of the Ireland they had left. And to the Kennedy family and to his generation in Ireland, him becoming President of America was a line in the sand, a new empowerment, a sense that if one of our own could get to the White House, nothing was beyond us. When I left school, I qualified as a social worker. I went to London and I spent 7 years working there. I learned a lot during those years in London, and not just because it was post the swinging 60s. It wasn't the valley of the squinting windows, that's for sure. I came back to Ireland with a sense of infinite possibilities. My eldest son had been born there. I got involved in women's rights, women's voices, and maternity hospitals. I felt that was really important. But I came back to an Ireland where it was still illegal to be gay, where the church controlled lives, where contraception was available only on prescription. I became chair of the National Women's Council and ended up leading it. And then I was asked to go into politics, and I went in. Like a lot of people, I got elected. I got defeated, I got elected again. I became Minister for Children, and then Minister for Justice and Equality, and now Minister for Business and Enterprise and Innovation, as well as Tánaiste Deputy Prime Minister. Wherever I went in government, I carried something within me, an unseen banner of one word: inclusion. The best definition of inclusion, in my view, is the one Franklin Roosevelt came up with. The story goes that a speechwriter put a manuscript in front of him, a manuscript of a speech the president was going to make. And one of the lines in the speech was, "We must build an inclusive society." And the story goes, it was a perfectly good statement, FDR stopped, looked at it, and he handwrote the replacement. "We must build a society where nobody feels left out." And that's the best definition of an inclusive society I've come across. And the reality is that when I started in politics, Ireland was very decidedly not a society where nobody felt left out. Many people felt left out. As I've said to you, women felt left out. But we began to change that, change it utterly, as I said at the beginning. The old career restrictions went, property restrictions went. Ireland became a better place for women, a place of possibility and pride, a place where women could and did hold every similar senior position in our criminal justice system, and a place where women could and have become president. 2 women have done that so far. One group who should have felt left out but were too young to understand the concept, Ireland's children, they were left out. So we put the rights of children into the Constitution back in 2012 when I was Minister for Children. We passed, all of us, a children's rights referendum. So for the first time ever, the state is now required to think of children as individuals, not simply as members of a family, but children's rights as well as adults' rights. Another group that left out were LGBTQI community. A former female Minister for Justice had abolished the laws that made being gay illegal. But removing legal penalties does not an inclusive society make, and most still felt that they lived in an Ireland of those squinting windows that I spoke about. They felt equal only up to a point, and that point was marriage. They could have a civil partnership. Big deal, most of them said. It isn't the same. This is not an inclusive society. If we feel left out of one of the key values of Irish society, family and marriage. And that's what happened on the 23rd of May 2015. But I want to tell you about 2 people coming up to that marriage equality referendum. The General Secretary of my political party is a former seminarian named Tom Curran. He stepped way outside his comfort zone, a regular mass-going, fairly quiet, self-effacing man. But this quiet traditionalist had a son. He had a gay son. And he stood up for his gay son in a video that went viral and encouraged others, so many others of his age and generation, to come out and vote yes for marriage equality. Then there was a woman, a TV reporter, called Ursula Halligan, a household name, familiar face, but still a very private person. And 2 weeks before we voted in the referendum, she wrote a column for the Irish Times newspaper about her 50 years of being in the prison of being silently gay. Tom Curran and Ursula Halligan laid their reputations on the line in the interests of inclusion, and so did many others. Their courage led to a glorious day in recent Irish history, May the 23rd, 2015. On that day, the quadrangle in Dublin Castle was filled wall to wall with couples, with their children, with rainbow flags, with happiness and with relief, as we celebrated the passing of the equal marriage referendum. All of Ireland, young and old, urban and rural, had made a gesture of inclusivity and said, you belong, you have the same rights, whether you're straight or gay. Welcome to a new Ireland that has its arms out for you. It felt like home. Every place that day felt like home. As Minister for Justice, I was responsible for the legislation. It was the best moment of my career. Ireland was the first country in the world to introduce marriage equality by way of referendum of the people. It broke the squinting windows forever. It told the world, we in Ireland are building a society where nobody feels left out. But we're not done. We're not nearly done. Inclusivity is a task that never ends, but never ceases to deliver emotionally, personally, socially, culturally, and economically. The next step for Ireland, and indeed for so many countries around the world, is to make sure that several groups of people don't feel left out. People like refugees and asylum seekers, people like migrant workers who bring their skills and their hopes to our countries, people like the elderly who so badly want to belong to a community, not just being seen as a category. I want to make sure that Ireland takes the next step for those with mental health issues, for people with a disability. I want to make sure Ireland takes the next step because I still carry that unseen banner with the single word, inclusion, on it. I always will. Thank you very much. Thank you.